Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Sheldon Bosley Knight's Land and Property Podcast, SBK Unplugged. My name is Kate Gould and I'm the host of the show. Today I'm joined by Dan Jackson and Charles Davis from our Strategic Land and Development Department. Welcome guys, lovely to have you in the studio.
Good morning.
Before we start, I would just like to thank One Mill Street in Leamington Spa again for hosting us today in their amazing studio. We're very lucky to be able to do so. So thanks guys for allowing us to be here once again. So, Dan, Charles, lovely to have you in the studio talking about all things strategic land and development. It would be great to find out what you guys do, what the department is all about, and projects that you're working on, how you fit in with the rest of the business. I know it would be good to talk about self-build, custom build, because that's a big element at the moment. And then if there are any other kind of market trends, anything that came out of the budget recently, any projects you're working on, that would be great. But I thought it would be good to start with you, Charles, find out a bit more about you. We know a bit about Dan and his route into land and property, but it would be great to find out why you chose this as your career and then how you got into Sheldon Bosley Knight. So I'd like to kick off.
No problem. So I joined Sheldon Bosley Knight 6-7 months ago, straight into the land team, which was great. But I started off, I guess, coming into property, having done an environmental management degree at Leeds University, not quite finding a job in the environmental sector. So applied to some property firms for work experience. That took me to Birmingham, where I started off just doing a month's work experience. And that transformed into a year's contract with Avison Young, at the time was known as Grimley, GVA Grimley, which was great. So I went straight into their development team, really looking at residential. But having a non-cognate degree meant you couldn't go straight on to becoming a chartered surveyor. So luckily for me, they helped sponsor me through Masters at Birmingham City University, which I did alongside becoming chartered and being on their graduate programme. So after 2 years, did the APC, completed the Masters and became chartered in 2018, which was great, and stayed within their development team until 2020, where I moved to Savills, also in Birmingham, into their development team, where I was there for 2 years. And then last March, I think it was, through a sort of industry contact stroke friend, Dan, I heard, was looking for somebody to join their development team. So like all good interviews, we went to the pub, had a couple of pints, discussed it, and arrived in September.
Excellent. So you joined last year, and how have you found it? And what is your is there a typical day-to-day that you have, or is it? Tell me about what you do.
What do we do? I'd say day-to-day, like most jobs, you always have to check your emails and see what's in there from the last day. But it's pretty varied in that you're not only ever working on one project. Stratland takes a long time for anything to happen, really, because of the planning and various other aspects of it. So you probably need 30 to 40 jobs going at once. Now, they're not all spinning those plates at the same time. You pick up certain ones and you put others down, but the day is never the same because of that. You're sort of flitting between projects and putting a certain amount of energy into one before picking up another.
But strategic land, you're talking about lots of different projects. So for those who perhaps not so au fait with the department,
what is it?
What is it?
Yeah. Thanks, Kate. Well, look, hard to define as any particular thing, but I suppose where we deal with strategic land, what we term it is long-term development projects, promoting land through the planning process, through the residential or commercial development, through the planning process, obviously with a view to a sale. So most of our clients would be private landowners, registered charities, we look after dioceses, and primarily edge of settlement, greenfield development sites. Now, in order to see those sites developed, there's a long-term planning promotion process that needs to work in hand with local plans, with district councils. There's a very big political element to that. And the costs involved with those projects is generally beyond the means of most landowners. And therefore, where our role primarily comes in is brokering agreements with developers, strategic land promoters, and those specialists in the industry with the track record, experience, contacts and funds in order to see those projects successfully through to completion. The reason our role is so important within that is because of the timescales, the complexities. Charles mentioned the nuances of those agreements, and obviously the values associated with them at the end of the day can be incredibly high. You know, we're often dealing with tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds in terms of land receipts at the end. There are tax implications to that. There are timing issues. And a lot of that just needs navigating, really, that myriad of technical, political, financial considerations for our landowners. So that's it in a nutshell. It's brokering those agreements. It's monitoring those agreements. It's negotiating prices, marketing for sale, and everything that goes along with that. But as Charles has mentioned, the nature of those agreements can often be very long term. I've exercised agreements in the last 12 months that were signed up by former colleagues of mine back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Now that's not every project, I'd hasten to add. You know, they can and do happen much quicker than that in some instances. But as I say, the nature of the workload and the various elements that feed into it mean that they can be very long term. Like Charles says, we've got a lot of those on at any given time.
Yeah. And I presume then you talk about planning and new homes. This is where Sheldon Bosley Knight plays to its strengths, because as a multidiscipline business, we have those resources, don't we? We have those particular departments that presumably you work alongside to get things over the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of true of a lot of companies that tend to do what we do. Is you rely on your own knowledge, but you need the planning advice. Or if there's a building on site that you need to take down, you might go to a building surveyor to find out how much it's going to cost to get rid of that. You also need to find out if it's contaminated land, how much it's going to cost to potentially rejuvenate it. And then you come into a whole new world of viability and is it going to be worth it? So there's the redevelopment of land can either be brownfield, greenfield, and that is where strategic comes in, because it's all about timescales and how long it's going to take to come forward.
So we work very closely, particularly our rural departments. Those colleagues over in Shipston, Jimmy Morton and his team over there, looking after those farmers in their day-to-day activities. So obviously a lot of the raw product, as it were, come out of those relationships. Obviously, I think we heard from Tash very recently, and as I say, her planning knowledge and input is incredibly helpful. Both up front in identifying opportunities, but also throughout the process in terms of timescales for applications and technical considerations. And then towards the end of the process, we work with our land and new homes team, so Nick Kiriaki, in terms of disposing of those sites, particularly the smaller, handful of 10 unit, perhaps, barn conversions, that sort of thing. Nick and his team will take those on, oversee those site sales, and then hopefully also pick up the new homes on the back of it to support the clients right the way through the journey. So really collaborative process from start to finish. And as I say, whilst we sit at the center of that, we rely very heavily on our colleagues and their expertise in terms of how delivering those solutions.
And over the years, have you seen any sort of trends in particular land sales or what people are building? I know that we've talked quite recently about self-build, custom build. So is that a major trend now, or is that been bubbling away for a while?
No, I don't think I think it's a newer trend, the self and custom build. I think probably over the last 10 years, there's been a push towards sustainable urban extensions in local authorities, which is big 5,000 home extensions where authorities can say, look, that's where the growth is going to come. More recently, there's been a lot more published about how actually there aren't as many small builders around, and they are good for the market in that they can create quite high quality bespoke dwellings and estates. And so that's where custom build's coming through, and it's sort of seeing a bit of a resurgence recently in that it's looked at in a different lens by authorities. It's not your standard housing supply. It's another one.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend. Yeah, I mean, custom build housing is relatively new policy. It's come out of legislation back in 2015.
Yeah.
Self and Custom Build Housing Act, and it puts the onus on local authorities to deliver a certain percentage of either self-built dwellings where people are building their own homes, the grand design type elements, or custom build, or actually rather than necessarily building their own home, there's a collaboration with the builders, but the end user having that principal design input. So there's an onus on local authorities to deliver those types of permissions. And we've been very involved in a number of sites locally. This is relatively new policy. It's relatively not misunderstood, but I think there's a lack of knowledge around it. And probably it's not the traditional house building model that this country has worked on.
And that's it, I think, crucially, is that not in this country, but abroad, it's quite commonplace.
Yeah.
I was lucky to be in New Zealand a year and a half, getting out there. It's very common. People buy what they call sections, which is your plot passport, is what we call it here. And then you have input on design, and you can build your own home, essentially, with a builder acting as contractor for you. And that's the model which we're sort of adopting over here now in these custom build sites. And they tend to be smaller. I think that's crucial. You don't really see custom build sites of 30 is probably your top end at the moment. But generally, what we're dealing with tends to be 10 to 15, 20 units.
And do you think the sort of self-build trend, if you like, has anything to do with things like grand designs? That, because I know that's been going for a long time, but I'm just curious to know whether it's
you can see totally why people want to do it. I mean,
I think it's intrinsic in a lot of people.
Yeah.
Do you want to build your own home?
We'll have our listeners. Yeah. I think we'd all like to have design input on our own home, but actually, do we really want to organise the bricklayers and and do the snagging on the dodgy plasterwork? I don't think we do really, but what we do want is to have input into where we're living and create influence in those spaces we're living in. So I think there's going to be an enormous consumer demand for it. I think developers are getting their heads around it as a delivery model, which is, as I say, works slightly differently to perhaps what they've been used to. And we're lucky enough to have a number of sites that we've either worked with land promoters or secured planning permission on ourselves through the teams in the office. And we're starting to see those projects come out of the ground now. So we've got sites over in Wellesbourne. We've got a couple on the market at the moment in Alderminster, in Halford. We just sold a site in Worcestershire and Cropthorne, where again we're now involved in the new home sale. So it's very exciting. We're probably doing more of this than probably your typical agents are, and we're really trying to fly the flag for it, because we think it's a product that we really believe in, and we think can offer a really nice alternative to perhaps just buying a house on a new build estate and and everything that comes with that. Don't get me wrong, it's not going to change that model, or it's not going to replace it. But
it's about diversifying the products that are out there.
Really. Consumer choice,
and I think what we can do, and what you asked, what we do in Stratland, is when we're advising our developers, is particularly with the custom build, it's a different model, different cash flow model that they might be used to, in terms of the way that they buy the land, and then they have to service it before they can sell it, as opposed to a typical development where they'll need to build the house before they can get any money back in. Yeah. So it's a different model, but one that we think can really work for these developers.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting, actually. So, I mean, it must be great to be working on projects like that, actually.
Yeah, and for me, definitely, it's something that I was looking at with Savills when I was with them previously. But to come to Sheldon Bosley Knight, and they've got 6-7 projects at the different stages, be it in planning, with planning, some about to go under construction, and somewhere actually we're looking to sell the end units. It's a great sort of life cycle of that custom build, which I wasn't exposed to previously.
Yeah. Are there any other trends sort of at the moment in terms of
I think the
projects you work on?
Yeah, the development market at the moment is an interesting place. It's cyclical, as with any property market. We saw a big slowdown during COVID, as was witnessed across the housing markets. That very quickly picked up post-COVID as the property market started booming again. And I think probably fair to say slowed down over the course of last year after the budget announcements, interest rate hikes and everything like that. But we've seen a clear change in the attitudes and the buying behaviours of house builders, really the beginning part of this year. I think there's cause for optimism in the market. Interest rates coming down. and a bit of confidence coming back into the house building model. So I think, yeah, absolutely cause for optimism moving forward.
Yeah.
As you say, there are a myriad of factors that will feed into that in terms of market conditions, interest rates, sales rates, which is obviously a big consideration for these house builders. But also on the affordable housing side. So most new build housing estates come with an affordable housing requirement that needs to be delivered on site. And those affordable housing homes, or those affordable homes, need to be delivered by a registered housing provider. Now, there was the big influx of government money into that sector, as I say, over the last few years, which really has helped sustain and bolster land values. We've seen some a lot of activity from those registered providers. That might perhaps cool down a little bit beginning of this year, but of course we're moving into an election year, and what's that going to hold? I think a lot of the industry commentators are talking about a change in government. What's that going to mean for house building generally? What's that going to mean into investment into affordable stock? We've watched this space, and we're alive to those issues and following closely.
Well, I was going to ask about the election, because obviously there is one imminent. We all know that. And a couple of questions as a result of that is, does an election make any difference at all to the market? And secondly, if there is a change of government, I know that the Labour Party has already said that greenfield sites should not be off the agenda when it comes to house building. And you touched on about the differences between brownfield and greenfield. So talk to me a bit about, because it's a bit of a hot potato.
Yeah, housing is a big political ploy, isn't it, really? And they both like to sort of use it to their own ends. I think the market's been underpinned recently, particularly the land market, by not having a lot of land with planning permissions, which has kept prices high. That plays through into the political system, where the planning system is very complicated by its own right, probably very under-resourced, and so planning permissions aren't coming through. And without planning permissions, you can't build houses. The argument of not building on greenfield is that you don't want to have urban sprawl. You don't want towns and cities spreading out to the countryside. Generally, that's the rule, which is why we have these greenbelt policies. So when you should build on brownfield. The issue with building on brownfield is generally it tends to be more expensive, because it will have had a commercial use on it or an industrial use on it before. That comes with cost of either knocking it down, cleaning the ground, and that cost can't just be absorbed. It doesn't just disappear. It comes through in the land value. So you might, when you get into the planning process, you might then have less affordable because you've got to pay. And so that affects housing delivery. So it's not a single fix, and that is something that has to be explored by a lot of governments.
And I think there's a distinction here as well between greenfield and greenbelt as well, and that's something worth bearing in mind. Greenbelt is a planning. It's a landscape designation that sits around a lot of urban conurbations, most local to here in Leamington. We've got the Birmingham Greenbelt that extends all the way into North Leamington. Green belt in itself is not allocated because of any intrinsic landscape beauty. It's not a conservation area. It's not an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's nothing like that. It is just a sort of relatively arbitrary landscape designation, but it has very important planning consequences, and it is sacrosanct. It's protected in planning legislation that it can't be built on unless it's released. And what that does is it artificially limits where development can go, and forces development into certain areas where perhaps, appropriately designed greenbelt development might actually be preferable. It will be interesting to see. Greenbelt will always be a political hot potato. There's no getting away from that, and it's a concept on which electoral campaigns are run. The protection of greenbelt is important. So we will see what that brings. From a personal perspective, I think we'd all like to see those greenbelt restrictions, if not lifted completely, certainly relaxed and dealt with probably on a bit more of a considered basis than a blanket. This is protected. So, as I say, what the next regime, if there is a new regime, brings, let's see. But as I say, it's
There certainly seems to be a sort of a feeling at the moment that if Labour were to get in, they would perhaps drive housing numbers.
Yeah.
But as you say, you have to wait. It's proof's been in the pudding.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the budget recently, there was a talk of building 1 million homes by the end of this parliament. Well, I mean, if that's May, that's, not achievable. And, 300,000 a year has also not been achievable, for the last few years. So it will be interesting to see. But in terms of an election generally, does that have any impact at all? Or is it just a kind of a momentary blip that we just have to sort of get
interesting
over?
to see. Traditionally, it would do, and there's always a nervousness. The fear of the unknown and an uncertainty is never generally good for investment.
Yeah. Albeit, I think where the market is at the minute, I think there's a lot of exacerbation around the planning system at the minute. So perhaps the feeling is, well, could it get any worse? And actually, a change might alleviate, and some change might be good.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Watch
it's one of
the
those.
space.
Yeah, it's a bit of a we'll have to see.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much for having a chat today. It's been great to see you.
Thank you.
And tune in for the next podcast.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Yeah, thank you very
Cheers.
much.